should be good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Susie, for inviting me to the Conscious Isolation talk. It's very good to be here. You specifically asked me to talk about women make sculpture, but I thought that it might be more interesting, since that's a new project, to talk about my work in general. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire Mander, and I'm a curator specifically for contemporary sculptural projects. And I have my own very independent curatorial practice called the CoLab. And my work is almost always site specific. It's almost always outdoor. And I work a lot with women sculptors. So what I thought I'd do is just kind of not start at the very beginning, but I'll start halfway through. If you have any questions during this talk, just put them into the chat. And if actually you want to stop me at any time, do, and I'll answer a question. I'm very, very happy to do that. Otherwise, I'll just whiz through, and then we can talk at the end. So some of you may know me from when I was at the Royal British Society of Sculptors, which is now the Royal Society of Sculptors, where I was deputy director. And there I was running something called the CoLab programme, which had several quite big projects within it. One of the little ones, which is where the interest or the ability to actually put women's work into the world, was in Napoleon Garden, which was run by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And it was a small garden that had almost exclusively shown the work of male sculptors for 100 years. So we thought we'd, with very little budget, we thought we'd get out there and get some women sculptors. And we did a nice programme, actually, of women sculptors. This is Cinta Tantra. This is her first outdoor work. And it was 2 perspex circles, which you could walk between, which made a lovely distortion of the garden. And it was it was successful. A lot of people passed, and it was a great project. This is Almut Tebanoff, who is a real woman who makes sculpture. She's a great welder, great craftswoman, spends a lot of time in Pietrasanta, and is also very, very charming. This was you don't quite get the luminosity of this work. It stands at 3 meters tall, so you could spend a lot of time inside it, which was part of the point of it. And this may be familiar. This is Helene Blumenfeld, who is she's an older sculptor now, very, very successful commercially, and she is a really wonderful woman. She takes a lot of young sculptors under her wing. She has done a lot to promote the craft of sculpture. And if you ever really want to find out what it's like trying to forge a career as a woman and as a mother, I suggest you look at her film, which her son, Rebbe Blumenfeld, has recently made, and in which people like Richard Stone, and I mean, there's a tiny 2 seconds of me in there, which is quite sweet, but it's a really interesting film about how you try and make it. The next big project I did was called Sculpture Shock. And this is the cover of the book, just because I found it and it just brought back such memories of the complexity of such a project. It took about 2 to 3 years to get it all together. It involved 3 site-specific commissions for 3 artists each year for 3 years, and they got a residency in a studio in central London, and they got £3,000 to spend on their temporary intervention, which would last for at least 4 days. So we didn't quite realise how popular this was going to be and how much of an appetite there would be to show work in response to sites and in such complex places. I'll do it by type. The first sort of type of place was the subterranean space. And this is Lynn Dennison, who is a really interesting artist. She works with sound and with video projection. This is in the Brunel Tunnel, which is in Rotherhithe, which you must visit. It's a very strange subterranean tube which linked to his tunnel that went underneath the Thames. It's quite a claustrophobic, quite frightening place. And she did this huge, I would play the video, but it's complex to do on this platform. Basically, you stand there and you have the waves rushing in and out and rushing in and out as if you're being crushed by the power of the Thames. And it really is quite an amazing work. This is not by a woman, but this is David Ogle. And these are the tunnels underneath Waterloo Station. He's also on the cover of the book. I think this is the moment when I felt the most bad, when I left him in this tunnel with just a little head torch on, and there was no other light and there was no other power, and he sat in there for 8 days installing this very, very complex series of light installations. It was a huge success, and he felt, I think, an amazing sense of achievement. This was in the Horse Hospital, and this is Patrick Lowry, who's another artist I've worked with again, who creates works that look like the real thing, and they are very, very deceptive. It's actually made out of sort of yogurt pop tops and pieces of MDF. So it's all, it's really incredibly made. He's a good artist. Amy Sharrock, some of you may know, this was part of the ambulatory. So this was trying to look at performance and live art as sculpture, which I think is quite an important aspect, that I think there are a lot of women who are working with their body. And of course, traditionally, women artists have only had their body to work with. It does, of course, it obviates the need to make things out of materials. You don't really need a studio. In fact, you don't even need permissions. We just did this, and nobody seemed to really mind. So you can do things, and it does have a great vitality. Amy did this series, which was on falling, and it was taking away the shame of falling, and taking away, naturalizing the fall as part of everyday life, and failure, accepting failure, embracing failure and falling. She's a very interesting artist. She brings people together in the most extraordinary way. It's almost like an enormous counseling session, and she really brings you out of yourself. We got people to fall on a mat at World's End, and this man staggers up with his sticks and things, and he said, "Do you think I can fall?" And we said, "Yes, you can do an assisted fall onto this blue mat." And I was absolutely terrified, thinking that thing, probably wouldn't work, and then he'd break his other leg. And anyway, it was all fine. It was interesting. She's a very empowering artist. This is the lovely Alexander Costello, who made this work by strapping himself to the front of a boat. So he was all he made was the steel armature. And then he bought this beautiful white suit as a nod to all the conceptual artists. He firmly believes that the ideas and the concepts behind the original, 1960s conceptual art are by no means over, and I agree with him. And this work was called Making Progress, and he was questioning whether you can make progress at 2 miles an hour along the canals of London. And we went through some interesting things with him. This is William Mackerel, and you can see that not everybody likes these kind of projects. That woman was livid that there were people singing on the bus, and William was sitting at the front, and he was making a drawing, which you can see on the right, or a series of drawings, and he was allowing the singers to interpret every movement of the bus and the vibrations and the sounds of London, and he was making a drawing which reflected that. This is Nika Nilova, who I've recently just got back in touch with because of this, in fact. And there she is in the studio of Elizabeth Frink, which we were lent by the borough, which I thought was just such an amazing place to be in, such a historic building. And then she leapt into the world of abstraction. This is her first abstract work. She works she's a very sincere artist. She's very intelligent. Her work is very mathematical. She gets very interested in the theories, the mathematical theories. And she carried this off. This is a really horrible space to work in because it's very, very fiddly. They call it the Cathedral to the Arts and Crafts. It's the Holy Trinity in Sloane Square. And I mean, there could hardly be more visual disruption, but she managed it. She did an absolutely brilliant job and produced this very contemplative work. This is Joanna Sands, who we had the nightmare of the venue changing 2 weeks before the installation. So frankly, is this work any longer site-specific? And we had some very interesting debates on that topic. Actually, it worked very beautifully in this space. And again, you can see she is a real maker, this woman. She's incredibly precise. The way that the ply rolled and moved from side to side was it was stunning, a real work of perfection. And this is the lovely and hilarious Hannah Haslati, who managed luckily to charm English Heritage, and Chiswick House, who gave us their temple, which they'd only ever used twice. It's one of the most beautiful spots in the whole of Chiswick House. And as ever, the groundsman, if you ever come across one, I've never met a groundsman who isn't absolutely fascinated by sculpture and incredibly sweet to artists. They cleaned and blackened the lake for us, which is what they used to do in the 18th century. They used to put ink in the water so that it was more reflective. So that was very beautiful. Then I'll just sweep past this one quickly. This was another one of the CoLab program, which was a major, huge project for 17 artists coming from the Nordic countries. So that involved lots of really fun research trips and finding out a lot about sculptors in these regions. Now, as for Sculpture Shock, it was not intentional that there would be a majority of women, but that is just what happened. Likewise, with the Nordic sculpture, I found that by chance, it was by open call. It's all very open, it's all very transparent. There's no funny stuff going on, and it's all really very much trying to help artists onto the next level rather than wooing already famous artists. This is a Swedish artist called Tove Hjelmark, and I don't know if you ever saw this, but what is about to happen is that this teddy bear, who is animated and moves around and squeaks, makes noises, is operated on by some of Sweden's, they are actually Sweden's best surgeons. And they came out of it saying that was one of the most unpleasant things they'd ever had to do. There is something deeply disturbing about it. She works a lot with the body, but also with the digital. It's good work. This is Mariken Kramer, who's talking about immigration in Norway, where they have a real problems about segregation, which is also very topical. These very, very beautiful 2-screen works. Those are 2 different works, very, very engaging, and actually have an amazing universality. This is for the real sculptors. This is a lady called Anne Koskinen, who lives in the sort of Finnish, to say the Finnish wastes is perhaps a bit unfair, but in a very remote part of Finland. And Finland is very, very flat, and it's very wet, and it's quite bleak. But she works in this place where there are these enormous stones, these huge boulders, and she walks around them and they call to her, and she will take one and she will sculpt out of it a figure that emerges from these things. And she does a whole series of foundlings, which are very small people who come out of these rocks. These things, that it's solid, it's not a light sort of drop thing. And this was a very weird thing. It never cooled down during the whole time of the exhibition. It was still as freezing as the day it arrived. Very, very beautiful. This obviously is talking a lot about women's place and how men overpower women often by cutting their hair and subjugate them in that way. Karianne Stensland is a Norwegian artist. She's about 6 foot and incredibly positive and cheery, wonderful woman. She was part of the High Heels, and they were a trio of feminist artists who did some very funny but very aggressive performances. They used to go into museums in their high heels, stand around, get drunk. They were very disruptive. They were very good fun. For this work, she decided to put herself into a state of hypnosis, carry an enormous block of marble outside onto the front terrace of the RBS, and then while she was in this state, take up this pneumatic drill and make a drawing on the stone with it. So it was quite, really quite an impressive idea. It was very tense, and I'm really glad there weren't any sort of police officers walking past. And miraculously, we got no complaints from neighbours, which we normally do on a regular basis over there. This was a beautiful work by Maya Nahiden. These are all separate pieces of paper, and we actually managed to get her to install it so that it was pouring out of our office, which is exactly how one feels being a curator in an organisation, particularly in a small organisation where the administration threatens to engulf you at any moment, and you desperately trying to get the action. This is probably the most touching thing about sculpture. This is Laila Pulinen. She is a Finnish, real heroine of the sculpture world. Everybody knows her. She's wonderful. Very, very old. And she said, this has made my life. I have always wanted, and she'd never exhibited, like many Nordic sculptors, a lot of them rarely go out of their country because they have good funding, etc. She said, I never thought I would exhibit in London, and now at the age of 80 odd, I am now doing it. I feel my life is complete. That's the kind of thing that makes your life worthwhile. You really think that's a really great thing I've done there. But very beautiful work. I mean, very much of her era, but she is so eloquent with her work. My next partnership, which again was not intended to be a majority of women, but happened to be like that, but it kind of speaks a lot to working with women. This was a project in Morecambe. Now, if you don't know where Morecambe is, it's a 90 miles intertidal, 90 miles round, the largest intertidal bay in England, in the northwest. And Morecambe Bay Partnership is this fantastic organisation that brings together every single person who has an interest in Morecambe Bay together to protect it, to promote it, to make it a wonderful place. They managed to get Heritage Lottery funding. I was the artistic advisor, so for the first time ever, I was not involved in funding, which was wonderful. And we had to select artists for Headlands to Headspace, which were a series of landscape art commissions. I'll just show you, it's a place of great natural beauty. It's also a place of great ugliness and great poverty. This is one side of Heysham Half Moon Bay, where you look out over the nuclear power station. And this is the beautiful view from Anna Gillespie's work, Ship, which she installed there. This is a fantastic, you can see how massive it is, hugely popular in quite a deprived part. If you carry along the bay, you get to a 6th century chapel, the ruins of a 6th century chapel. It's just an extraordinary place. These two figures which sit on top, one looks towards the power station, which in a way looks towards the future, and the other looks towards the chapel, which in a way is the past. And there was a little child who came up and said, Mummy, why have they got holes in? They've got holes in their torsos. And he said, well, that's the feeling you feel when you're not at home. That's the feeling of homesickness, when you don't know where you are, when you don't know where you belong. And Anna Gillespie picked it up on one of the Twitter things, and she goes, you have to be a child to understand these things. This was a new thing for me. This was a commission of dance singing, site-specific dance singing from About Time Dance Company. And it was actually phenomenal. This sunset, I know he's put a slight filter on it, but it actually was pouring with rain until seconds before the performance. And then the bay just opened up with this sunset. It was the most incredible experience. Really, that's when you do believe in animism. A project that is ongoing, and I'll just show you where I should be now. That's where I should be now. We should be doing the 2nd year of a project called Body in Place, which was primarily for sculptors, but any artists. And it is all about drawing. And that man there, standing up, talking, is Martin Morris, who is the most fantastic teacher I've ever come across in my life. And he wants to bore down into the very heart of your creativity and make you change your work, change the way you view the world. And he really succeeds in doing that through life drawing, which we really wanted to shake up a bit. It's such an important part of, work and sculpture, but it's become rather staid. So that's the kind of thing we were doing. We were looking at the body in the context of the landscape on this one. We were looking at it in the context, that's at the at Windsor Castle, where we were allowed to look at the collections, and then we were allowed to have our model there after looking at, Leonardo's and Raphael's and that and so forth. It was really incredible. Now, this is incidental to the Women Make Sculpture, because as you'll notice from all these photos, and I feel rather stupid in the selection meeting saying we must have 50% women, must have 50% women. And I realised that actually 90% of the people applying were women, so we would have women anyway. It worked brilliantly. This is all about collaborative drawing. Women are brilliant at collaborating. And apparently, and I need to research this more, but the reason why women apply for this and came on this is because they don't mind failing publicly or in a group scenario, whereas men on the whole, and we did have four men, do not enjoy that experience at all. So that's very interesting, and I would like to know more or hear what you think about it. Here are 4 of the girls just demonstrating how wonderful they are at collaborating. They had to draw on top of each other's drawings, so you had to really let go of what you were making. You had to let someone else put their marks on it, and it was so painful to start with. It was really awful, but they all did it, and they really enjoyed it. It was really amazing. Now, this is my latest project, which we started in 2018, and it just does what it says on the tin. Basically, there's a bit of an issue with public art. I mean, there's more than one issue with public art, but one of them is that there are very few outdoor works by women sculptors. There are some, and there have been some in the past, some very successful women sculptors, but on the whole, they don't really seem to get a look in. This is going to be an ongoing project to answer the question why, but also I don't really just like to answer the question. All my work is very practical. I like to see something happening and to do something and to draw conclusions from whatever happens. So we decided to launch this as an open call. Obviously, the prize money is too little, or the commission money rather, at £15,000, but it is a start. We had great difficulty, as ever, in finding someone to collaborate with on this, because there aren't very many public spaces that will allow you to show a work by an artist that is not known. Well, when you don't even know who the artist is, you don't know what the work is going to be, and various other unanswered questions. People are not really interested in experimenting with their public spaces, and I'll probably get less of that now. So we managed to find the wonderful UCL, and this was a great collaboration because they're very open-minded. They have a public art programme. Of course, they've got the Slade, so they are totally used to dealing with artists. They understand that artists are not vandals trying to destroy, everybody's public spaces. They're actually very sensitive, interesting people who are trying to make the world a better place. And they said yes to this. They judged it with us. We had Sam Wilkinson and who is very, very experienced, as well as Polly Baleka from Pangolin and Zoe Laughlin, who run something called the Institute of Making. She's interested in materials and what you need to put together to make things. We selected Rachel Ara because on the basis that she would not make a work that was like any of the other work she'd made before. But this is also something that I am very intent on doing. I think that, and maybe it's wrong, but I think I get very worried about artists who get into a rut and they start making the same work over and over again. So she presented a neon work, and we said, look, we'll take you, but not if it's a neon work, because you're going to do something else here. And she came up with a much better idea than a neon work, which was to create a descent module, a space descent module, which would make a comment on all the fact that there are no women in STEM subjects, there are no women anywhere. It creates a safe space. It's a space where you can talk about anything. It's a space, it's actually an anechoic chamber, so you can actually just sit there and meditate, and you can, repair, or everyone could go and repair their sort of probably by now slightly damaged mental health. But it's also, interestingly, or what we tried to do with it, which actually is kind of sort of in a very bizarre way seems to work with lockdown, is that we decided not to announce it. And we decided that we are not going to create a fully finished work in the way that a male sculptor would. It's not going to be heavily engineered. It's not going to be made of steel. It's not going to be 6 meters tall. It is going to be an object which is going to incite curiosity. What you see is not what you get. What you see is what you have to explore. You have to have a lively mind in order to solve the riddle of this work. So we decided not to announce it. And in fact, it sat there quietly. We haven't done much about it. Isn't she beautiful? And she is called Valerie. She has an AI system which is basically sucking in all the information around her. So she needs a public. She's totally handmade by the artist. So she's made from a very wooden structure, and then all of this cladding is made by hand, with a door which is actually from a real fighter plane. And we're just hoping that it's watertight. Again, this is her first outdoor work, so this was a huge learning curve for her in all sorts of ways. This is the interior. Wouldn't you just love to be in there? And it's all this totally silent. This is all made from anechoic foam. And Valerie, you can talk to Valerie if you want to. You can talk to her. She's been trained on various feminist texts that Ara has given her to understand, to formulate her own view of the world. But she's coming with messages for us all. So do get in contact with her. And one day she'll reply. And one day maybe we'll even be able to crack her and get inside. But who knows? She may be there forever if nothing opens again. I was really happy to be invited. This was before lockdown, to participate in something which is very women-centric, which is a really good organisation called the Procreate Project. And they are supporting women artists who are mothers. And this is rather a taboo subject. Nobody really, in paintings and sculpture, there aren't very many. There are a few. There's recently an exhibition about pregnancy, actually, historic paintings of pregnancy. There's very little, very few paintings, very little about the whole process, very little about anything to do with women or blood or, anything like that. So, which they believe there should be more of. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be out there. It's half of the population anyway. And they run this prize called the Mother Art Prize. And they had this really cool panel, including Frances Morris and Neve from the Saltoun Gallery and, various other people. It was extraordinary, really, with these amazing applications. They had something like nearly 500 applications of artist mothers making work that related to childbirth and that kind of thing. Really interesting. And they also run the Mother's House Studios, which support women artists. Again, hugely practical approach. Funds, gets money for people to make work and gives them studio space. The other thing that I do to support women artists, which again is massively active, is the UK Friends of the National Museum of Women in the Arts. If you haven't been to Washington, you need to go immediately, because this is a fantastic museum, and it's the only museum in the world that is a major museum in the world that's dedicated to work by women artists, which I think is horrifyingly shocking, but it's also a great collection. It's a small museum, and its real strength is that it has appointed 23 committees worldwide, all of whom are totally independent. They can do what they want as long as they champion women artists in their region. The UK, I'm chair of the steering committee of the UK one, which is obviously the best one. And we run many things, loads of visits, loads of studio visits, loads of talks. We do massively sort of active. It's 50% American, 50% English. So it's a really kind of dynamic mix of people. But the major project we run is Women to Watch, where we, every 2 years, and I'm just doing the ones I've been involved with, we select up to 5 artists according to the museum's theme, and we show their work in London, and then one of them is picked to go to the States. So last year we had Paper, and we had those artists, Charlotte McGowan Griffin, Mary Evans, Abigail Reynolds, Ludovica, absolutely brilliant artist, and Sophie Bouvier-Auslander. And for Metal in 2017, we had Rana Begum, Alison Wilding, Sarah Barker, and Claire Barkley, which was really amazing lineup of artists. This is the Metal one, which we had at Phillips, which was really snazzy space, and that's Rana's mesh work, which was a new work she'd done, and that's Rana as well. Those are some of Alison Wilding's small pieces. We also had a massive one of hers, and Sarah Barker in the background. And there's Rana looking happy because she got selected to go to the States, which is actually a very good opportunity, because I think for sculptors it's very difficult to break into the American market, partly because the work is not very portable, and partly because they've, you know, it's a big old place, so they've got a lot of their own artists. This is the most recent one. This is Paper, and this is a wonderful view of how work should be done. This is Sophie Bouvier-Auslander with her favourite installation companion, who's her daughter, who comes with her everywhere. They pack everything up in 2 suitcases, and they make these enormous installations together, and they just work, and they do it in a couple of days. They are just so sweet. They were just an absolute joy to have, and are very fabulous. These are all individually inked tracing paper. Absolutely beautiful. It looks like an explosion. Sotheby's were awesome, and they gave us an all-women team, including all the hangers, all the installation people, who were so chilled that even when faced with this Abigail Reynolds layout, they just said, right, we're starting with the first one, and then they ploughed on through, and they did all of that in a couple of hours. It was fantastic. Beautiful work. That's Ludovica. I'm sorry, Ludovica, this is not a very flattering photo. I don't know why I couldn't find one, because you're normally so glamorous. And those are 2, they're both not mine, but looking into the origin of the world. And this is Mary Evans, whose work will be going to the States this time, which is really exciting. And she will be doing a talk for NUMWA, which we'll publicise, which will be very interesting, about her paper cutout installations. Again, she does site-specific installations like this. And she'll be doing a very big one for the museum, which will hopefully be taking place. So these are past Women to Watch women. Rose Wiley, she's very sweetly kind of credits us with having made her name, and of course Polly Morgan. So if you are interested in actually making an active contribution to changing the position of women artists, it is a very good organisation to support and to get involved with. And I think that's the end. And back to my dear Frink, who we gave to the museum, and of course Cornelia Parker. That's it. So thank you, Susie.
Thanks so much, Claire. I've unmuted everyone, so if anyone has any questions. Also, can you just unshare your screen? I'll just put it into gallery view. That's okay. Thank you. Yeah, better. Yeah, does anyone have any questions to ask Claire? I'll go first. I've got a question. Wondering what you think is the kind of biggest challenge for an artist when working on a public commission that they have to overcome?
The biggest challenge is getting the first outdoor work out there, is finding someone that will take the risk. And I think that is a huge challenge. It's difficult to overcome. I mean, I tend to run projects where we're willing to take that risk, but it's extremely difficult to find partners who are willing to take the risk with you. So I think what you need to do, I mean, and I think also people need to be shown things. They need to be shown concrete examples. A drawing's not enough. So even if it's a even if you make a maquette or even if you do something temporary, show people that you know how to make it work, because you're always, as sculptors, fighting against gravity. You've got to persuade people that it's going to be, safe, that it's going to stand up, that it's going to look how it looks on a small scale, on a large scale. And of course, there are always, problems of expense. But I think in order to allow people to visualize really, really helps.
Can you talk a little bit more about the commissioning process the difference between how you might approach open calls for public commissions versus long listing and short listing of artists, and what you might be kind of looking out for at different stages or different kind of commissioning processes?
So basically, most of the things I do are by open call, because number one, I think you often find someone that you've never heard of. It's much more interesting, and it's a real level playing field. So for open calls, the problem with open calls is you've got a massive load of competition. But we still find with all the open calls, you've probably got between 150 and 500 applications for each thing, because there are so few opportunities. You need to make your work stand out. So you need to be really succinct. You need to choose the best images. I think it's very difficult for artists to self-edit, because you're very close to your work. Ask for someone to choose the 5 images of the work that you think is the strongest and the most relevant. So that's one thing. Then the second thing is, if you are asked, for Women Make Sculpture, I made a terrible mistake. And the terrible mistake was that I spent £3,000 of my budget asking the shortlisted artists to come to the interview having made a presentation. And only 2 of the artists turned up having made a presentation. And I'm not going to say who. But, if you're going to a formal interview, you're shortlisted, put a lot of effort into that interview, because frankly, it speaks to how much effort you're going to put into the commission. And if you can't be professional about that, and you can't be bothered to make it's all, I think partly it's because it was all with women as well. Be careful, because women are just as professional. I'm no more friendly to a woman artist who's applying than I am to a male artist, and I will not favour a woman artist if the work isn't better. And don't rely on that, because there isn't positive discrimination when it comes to these things, really. It's just got to be the best person. So I would be really careful, be very, very thorough. Then I also think you should, if you're being, especially on the other type of commission, which is if you're being invited and you're a handful of people that are being invited to apply for something, if you're allowed to, I would definitely ring up the person who is running the prize, and I would ask things. I would make some kind of personal contact. I think people are increasingly looking for people that are able to, people that are able to speak, people that are able to express themselves properly, which actually I think is slightly unfair. And I don't actually, in my heart of hearts, believe that an artist should have to be able to speak for their work to be brilliant. But anyway, that's a slightly different point. But they are looking for that. They're looking for the ability to communicate across social media platforms and all that sort of thing. So you have to increasingly be able to show that. But I think really it's in the strength of the work. Have you understood the brief? The Headlands to Headspace was funded by the Heritage Lottery. It was absolutely clear that it had to have a heritage element. And about 80% of the applications had no heritage element. And it has to, you just can't, we can't get the funding. Think about who's funding. Find out who's funding. If it's just private philanthropists, you're free. You can do anything you want. If it's Heritage Lottery, you've got to have that. If it's, the library thing, it's got to be linked to the site. Just think very carefully, basically. And ask advice, ask advice.
Do you have any other questions?
I'm interested to know more about the challenges of site-specific work. And your experiences with that?
The challenge is that basically it makes everything work in the gallery is very comparatively easy because you have normally white walls, you know the dimensions, you know how much weight the floor can carry, you have specific lighting that you can manipulate, you know exactly what the sound levels are, you know the capacity of the room. Easy peasy. Site-specific work is about the most complicated work you can do because you know, you probably won't have a structural engineer coming in and giving you an opinion unless you've got a big budget. You have no idea what the people are going to be like, who's going to turn up. It's difficult. You have weather to deal with. You have no control over the lighting conditions. So something like Morecambe Bay was absolutely horrendous. When those dancers went out there and it was raining, I was just thinking, this is going to, I mean, that is what it's like. It could either be that beautiful sunset or it could be torrential rain and they could have been literally blown off the side into the sea. So you're constantly on tenterhooks. The plus side is that when it works, it really works. And actually it's the most vital and it's the most interesting of all sculptural work there is, because the work has had to, you know, it's had to compromise. You have to be so resourceful. You have to use things that don't damage the land. You have to use things that don't pollute. You are very restricted to how far you can dig. You've got to be so clever. You can't control the public. You cannot control anything about it apart from the work. The work has to be incredibly strong to stand up to a really good site-specific intervention. So that's really the difficulty of it, but it's the best work really, because there's a dialogue. There's a dialogue between the place and the artist, and a dialogue between the work and the people, and it's the most invigorating work there is. I mean, I've never really often got much of a buzz out of work in a white room, and so really I am incredibly passionate about getting work out of the gallery, which is a very clinical, and actually even I really still feel scared going into some of those galleries in Mayfair. I mean, they have bouncers, for God's sake. I mean, it's absurd, you know. It's not nice, that's not what it's about. You're meant to be able to go up and touch things and sort of, you know, sit with them and listen to them and talk to them and, you know, so I don't know, especially for sculpture. Sculpture is about place. And so the site-specific work, that's what it should be about. And really, we should have work everywhere. It should be on every street. It should be on every wall. We should be, you know, the artist is essential into making us understand our surroundings and life in general, really. But I'd probably start with a gallery space if I were just launching into a career, because it is a lot easier. I mean, it's a lot easier. And cheaper.
Any other questions? Claire, what's next for you? Have you got any future ambitions for future projects, or is it hard to say with the current
Well,
situation?
that's a good question. Yeah, I've got a really good idea coming up. I'm not going to tell you what it is in case it ruins it. But I've decided to totally not totally reinvent myself, but slightly reinvent myself with a whole new project of things, which is going to be really fun. And then I'm going to carry on Women Make Sculpture, and I will carry on the drawing because that's really important, and see where those things go. But you know, I can't confirm or deny what the future holds, like so many other people. But don't worry, there'll be something, and it will definitely involve sculpture, and it will definitely involve women and site-specific work. So kind of, yeah.
Sounds exciting. Very exciting. On that note, should we do this every time? If we can unmute our microphones, just give Claire a big round of applause. Thank you so much for speaking for us.
I did actually have one more question, but I was on mute, so I didn't really.